This is Free to Exchange, the show where free-thinking scholars, free markets, and, ironically, free public television all meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. Today, Free to Exchange is going to plunge into history. First, we're going to look at Texas and discuss the good, the bad, and the ugly of the history of liberty in the early republic, and then the state. Then we'll discuss the scourge of the seas, 17th century pirates. They plundered treasure ships but managed to govern themselves pretty well internally. We'll find out how. My first guest is Dr. Phil Magness. Dr. Magness is a policy historian and academic program director for the Institute for Humane Studies. He's the author of the book Colonization and Emancipation, Lincoln and the Movement for Black Resettlement. He also happens to be a native Texan. Phil, welcome back to Texas.
Thanks for having me.
So the kind of standard history that I often hear about the settling and founding of Texas is, it's nothing about liberty. It's a land grab by, the manifest destiny, early version of Americans running across, and that in particular, since so many of them come from the South, it's about pushing slavery west. You don't really buy into this.
Right, I actually challenge it. And to take up this issue, we've got to dig deep into Texas history. And the thing to realize is that Texas, when it is settled by Spain, it's really kind of an economic backwater. It's on the edges of the frontier, really the edges of the world at that time. And we can trace the settlement. The first permanent Spanish settlements, they emerge around the San Antonio area today. And this is around 1716 or so. But to give you an idea, for an entire century of Spanish presence in Texas, it has a population that's next to nothing. There are 1,500 people here. In 1720, a century later, there's 3,000 people. So it's really kind of the backwater of the world as far as the Spanish Empire is concerned. Mexico achieves its independence in 1821, and one of the things that's ascendant, the Mexican independence movement, it's mostly Republican. It's a backlash to the Napoleonic era that's going on in Europe. They overthrow Spain, they push out the monarchy, but the next big division that emerges in Mexican politics is the liberal federalists, the people that want a decentralized government devolved to the states, built on liberal constitutional order. And then you have these centralists that come in, they want everything done from command down in Mexico City.
Sure.
But the liberals are ascendant after the revolution, and one of the things they do is they see we need to develop Texas, so they open up the borders basically and invite American immigrants in.
So it wasn't a land grab by the Americans, it was the Mexican government begging them to come in to settle it as a defense against the encroaching Indians?
Encroaching Indians. Big thing that happens in the 18th century is the Comanche tribe breaks away from the Great Plains and it migrates southward. And it moves effectively into Texas after about 1740 or so. And this does two things. One, they basically go to war against all the other Indian tribes, the native tribes that were in Texas. They push them out, but then they butt up against the Spanish settlers. So this problem's still going on for the century that follows that. So what Mexico was thinking is, you bring in a farmer class of settlers. You settle mainly in the agricultural area along the Gulf Coast, and that creates kind of a buffer on the frontier. It's also a buffer for Mexico's sake because they know that American interest is pushing westward. After the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the boundaries aren't really well defined. So they figure, if they settle Texas, even with American settlers, that you make them citizens of Mexico and you solidify a more permanent claim to this kind of contested middle region.
And were these formerly American people settling in Mexico, did they mostly become Mexican citizens?
So that's part of the contract is, the Mexican government signs these land dispersers, they call them impresarios. Stephen F. Austin's the most famous. And part of the contract is if you move here, you become a Mexican citizen. And one of the things Austin does, to give you an example, in 1829, Austin writes a letter to his brother-in-law who's in Missouri and says, come on down to Texas. And he says two things in the letter. He says, first off, that the Mexican government has the most liberal immigration policy in the world that we know of today. And number two, if this pattern continues, if our political development continues, we're going to be better than Uncle Sam back in Washington.
Wow. So now, but this liberal immigration regime for Mexico, it didn't work out very good. So did these Americans come in here and basically double cross them and say, oh yeah, you invited us in, this was peaceful, but forget our contracts and liberty. you're out of here.
Well, it's quite the contrary. So a couple of events happen. Mexican politics is very unstable at the time. In 1828, there's an emergent liberal order. One of the great generals from the Mexican Revolution against Spain, Vicente Guerrero, is president of Mexico. He's a pro-immigration guy. He's pro-free trade, just a classical liberal in every sense. Austin loves him. The political class in Texas are all behind him. He gets knocked out in a coup d'etat and basically dragged out and executed by the centralizers, the conservatives. And one of the first things that the conservatives put through, this is Anastasio Bustamante, who seizes power. He passes a law that suspends and cuts off immigration into Texas. Basically says foreigners are no longer welcome, and not only that, we're going to immediately cancel all pending land contracts with these impresarios to bring them in. So that's the first thing that really starts to go south. Also part of this package, they adopt a protectionist trade regime of tariffs. They're trying to redivert economic commerce that had been coming up and down the Gulf Coast from like New Orleans down to Mexico's home industry. So they view this as a classic mercantilist system. That's the first step. Well, Bustamante.
Did this isolate the Texans then from trade with the United States?
So that was the intent of it. There's some revolts that emerge, small pockets of resistance to overcome the tariff regime. And there's a lot of smuggling that emerges along the coast as well.
So, is it that what leads the Texans to want
that's what really
independence, or
precipitates.
what else happens?
Yeah, so that's the first step. There's a very unstable period of Mexican history, several coups d'etats. A character emerges on the scene by the name of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, and we all know Santa Anna. He initially is aligned with the liberal faction, and he comes into power in 1833, 1834-ish. Originally is someone who's seen as sympathetic to the liberals over the old Bustamante regime. But he starts to centralize power in Mexico City. He had actually been an ally of a major Tejano politician, that's Lorenzo de Zavala, who is one of the impresarios, one of the big figures of early Texas politics. And he appoints Zavala to be minister to Paris. And while he's gone, Santa Anna starts doing things like suspending sessions of Congress. In 1834, he disbands the National Congress. 1835, he basically declares himself dictator for life and suspends the entire Constitution of Mexico. Well, this sets off a wave of revolts across Mexico. Texas is one of those revolts. There are several others. The Yucatan Peninsula goes into a secessionist movement. Zacatecas, the state just north of Mexico City, goes into open revolt. And Santa Anna sends out the army to suppress these pockets of resistance that are coming up to his regime. This causes Zavala to resign, and he flees back to Texas, attempts to start organizing a resistance government to restore the old Constitution. And this is what kind of leads us to the Alamo. So after Santa Anna's army suppresses the Zacatecas revolt, he turns northward. Santa Anna is a consummate xenophobe. He's a demagogue. He's a militarist. He's a military man as well. And he enters into Texas basically making proclamations that he's going to crush these foreign invaders and push them off the coast, that we can no longer tolerate them because they're trying to seize our land.
Foreign invaders who had been invited and became citizens.
Exactly.
So you would say then, rather than the standard kind of history of Americans wanting to come over and take Mexican land for themselves, that rather they immigrated, became Mexicans, but felt they got a raw deal from the Constitution and the liberal order and said, okay, no more.
Yeah, and it really turns. And you know, there's still the liberal pocket in Mexican politics that's fighting against Santa Anna. And they are aligned with the Texas, the Anglo-Texas settlers in this movement. There are several of the leading political families around San Antonio that had been there for 100 years or more. They all signed with the Texian revolutionaries. Some of them were present at the Alamo. Several signed the Declaration of Independence, become very prominent figures in Texas politics.
So we have just a few minutes left, but there's no shortage of wars in our own American Revolution maybe that starts off on principles of liberty, but then when the war's over, you wonder how much was actually gained for liberty versus lost in the aftermath. How would you evaluate the aftermath of this in terms of liberty in Texas?
Yeah, it's a real mixed bag. The good that comes from it is the establishment of a constitutional system of government, rule of law. They're generally pro-free trade, generally liberal-minded. The bad all starts to emerge with the annexation push that occurs 1845, 1846.
So not something uniquely Texan.
No, it's an American institution. To give you an idea, so slavery is always there in the background, and it had been a problem. Several of the Austin settlers brought their slaves with them, but there's a very slow, gradual expansion of slavery in Texas in the Republic days. There were about 5,000 slaves in 1836. The best data we have suggests this grows to between 15 and 20,000 over the next decade or so. But something happens after annexation. Now it's brought under the laws of the United States, which has things like suppression of mail that's pro-abolition. They have the U.S. Army to put down slave revolts. They get the Fugitive Slave Act. There's a rapid influx of slavery into Texas after 1846. And it jumps from maybe 20,000 slaves to almost 100,000 over the course of a decade. You grow the slave population from 10 to 15% of Texas to 30% on the eve of the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And it's really all these southern plantation owners that are moving in from the Carolinas and Georgia and Mississippi. And lo and behold, they also become active in politics. So you get a shift away from kind of the old Republican ideals that Sam Houston, people like that had represented. You get these emergent slave power politicians that are trying to bring the Texans more into alignment with what becomes the Confederacy.
Yeah, and so in our last minute here, then of course we have the Civil War and the break. Yeah. But when we look today, Texas is one of the freer states in the United States, and we certainly think of the individualistic kind of ethic here. You want to connect the 2 points at all for me in the last moment here?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of the accidents of the Civil War, Texas being still on the frontier and it's kind of isolated from the conflict. Strict accident of history, although some strategic military actions happen, it basically never suffers the movement of armies into the interior of the state. First, they're all repulsed at the border, and second, the war comes to an end before there's really a conquest. So we don't get as much of the baggage, whether racially, politically, economically, that plays out in the East. Even though Texas does have racial problems, it's a segregated society, but it's a much more stable footing that they re-enter into the political discourse after the Civil War.
All right, well, thank you very much for joining me, Phil.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Peter Leeson. Dr. Leeson is the Duncan Black Professor of Economics and Law at George Mason University. He's also the author of The Invisible Hook, The Hidden Economics of Pirates. Pete, welcome to Lubbock and to the show.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's start talking about the hidden economics of pirates here. And by pirates, we're going to be talking about 16th, 17th century pirates?
Early 18th century pirates, the pirates of the Caribbean. These are the guys immortalized by Walt Disney Corporation.
All right. And how did they go? So they were obviously very successful at plundering a lot of loot, gold coming out of Central America. How did they undertake organizing for these operations?
So as criminals, it's a really interesting puzzle because as criminals, pirates didn't have access to government-provided law or order. But their ships, in order to successfully plunder merchant ships, which is the prizes that they were after, they had to cooperate in large numbers for many months together at sea. And so this posed this basic kind of social problem of how is it that we're going to prevent raucous criminals from engaging in criminal and raucous behavior on the ship, which could tear the ship apart, prevent pirate cooperation, and so on. And remarkably, what pirates did was actually develop a system of essentially constitutional democracy, complete with checks and balances, very similar in a sense to the way the modern American government is set up, but they did so in the early 18th century.
They did it before the governments actually.
Yeah, more than half a century before. And it wasn't government. That's the thing, is that governments, compel people to do things. We're part of the United States government basically as a result of coercion in most cases. With pirates, it required, in order to join a pirate crew and to sign on to its constitution, you had to do so voluntarily, and pirate ships had unanimous consent among their crew members.
They didn't like take crew from ships that they were capturing and like force them into service, like a draft, basically?
They occasionally did do that. However, in general, they didn't want to do it for two reasons. First, in order for their system of constitutional democracy to function, since they had no outside parties to rely on, they wanted people who wanted to be there, right? Otherwise, it would present a problem. Relatedly, they didn't want to press, it was called pressing, pirate conscription, too many sailors, because if they did, one of these guys might escape, and then he could go and rat on the whole pirate crew, which would lead to problems for them with the authorities.
So, you've mentioned their constitutional government checks and what were their checks and balances?
They did a couple of things. So in the first place, they divided authority up between various officers on the ships, the crucial ones being the quartermaster and the captain. In popular pirate fiction, we usually think of the captain as sort of wielding autocratic control and being this really powerful guy.
Right.
In fact, on Caribbean pirate ships, the captain was a secondary officer who had very few powers relative to the quartermaster, who in fact sort of oversaw day-to-day activities on the ship. So that's how they divided power.
And what was the captain in charge of then?
The captain had autocratic control only at one time, which was when the pirate ship was in chase or battle. He was basically a military commander for the crew. The rest of the time, and most of the time pirate ships were not engaged in battle, they were sailing around searching for prizes. The quartermaster was the guy who was kind of in charge.
And did they actually write up these rules?
Yeah, so in addition to dividing power, they created, as I mentioned before, pirate constitutions, and they actually wrote them down. They were very simple and very short, and they said basic things. They laid out the terms of piratical employment, so what your compensation would be for being a member of a pirate crew. But also, and perhaps most crucially, they created laws that governed conflict, prevented theft, governed violence, and governed a variety of sort of what economists call externalities, behaviors that some crew members might engage in that could spill over onto the rest of the crew, causing problems for them.
So like the picture of the pirates, yo-ho-ho, and the bottle of rum and music and stuff on deck, like that type of thing?
A little bit, yeah.
Because that could kind of annoy me if I was trying to sleep.
Well, so actually the sleeping provision so one of the sort of template classic pirate constitutions comes from Bart Roberts, who was the most successful pirate captain of the Golden Age, this era in the early 18th century. And his crew had a provision that actually related to music. So the musician on the ship who provided entertainment was to actually be given a day off to keep holy the Sabbath, which is a kind of puritanical aspect of pirates that we don't normally think about. But when it came to the to the sleeping aspect, there was a rule that regulated when and where you could drink. Pirates liked their alcohol. They liked their grog, and so drinking was restricted to the deck after 8 p.m., sort of early lights out, so that pirates who were tired could get their sleep.
And these things, what was the economics behind compensating the pirates then? If they didn't get a paycheck when they went there, how did they arrange that in a way that makes sense?
They got a share of the booty that they seized. So most members of the crew each got a single share, so they were all getting roughly the same amount. The difference was the officers got paid slightly more, in part because their tasks were more valuable. So the captain would usually get 2 shares, the quartermaster might get a share and a half, and then some smaller officers might get about a share and a quarter. But there was a relatively flat pay scale on the pirate ship. Going from 2 shares to 1 isn't a huge deal.
And what would happen if you got injured in battle like this? Did you, or for that matter, killed? I suppose you didn't get paid a share to your family if you were killed, but what if you were injured?
Well, almost. So this is another fascinating feature of pirate governance in their constitutions. They codified in their constitutions an early system of workers' compensation, piratical employment insurance. Pirates weren't unionized, and nevertheless they managed to come up with this system. And the idea was that depending upon the injury that you sustained in piratical employment, you would receive out of the crew's common stock, before the shares were paid out to individual crew members, a certain amount off the top, the payment that you received corresponding to the type of injury that you had sustained. So for example, losing a right arm in battle would be worth more in insurance than a left arm, presumably because most pirates are right-handed, so the right arm was worth more, and so on, a different amount for your left eye versus your right eye. Some of these things were very elaborate.
Wow, and I guess presumably that would help incentivize them in battle then to take more risks, which would be a positive benefit for the rest of the crew because of the pay structure?
Precisely, that's exactly why they did it. It's not that pirates were particularly generous or interested in social welfare, it's that they needed to incentivize guys to engage in privately costly activity. It was very dangerous to give it your all in a fight.
This is kind of, as your book subtitle on this one is The Invisible Hook, this is the Adam Smith invisible hand of their economic self-interest leading them to adopt things that make everybody better off.
Yeah, that's
or
exactly right.
Everybody on the ship better off.
That's
Maybe
right.
not society at large.
That's right. I mean, sort of an interesting feature of this is that by pursuing their self-interest, the pirate crew, as a consequence, was able to cooperate better. But that in turn meant that they were able to be more devastating and destructive to legitimate citizens who they were plundering.
And speaking of the devastation to legitimate citizens that they're plundering, that they've been known to commit acts of torture of the victims that they plunder and stuff. What was the rationale behind that?
So they actually have the part of this torture policy that pirates had that gets played up is the gruesome, and they were gruesome tortures that they inflicted on any prisoners who basically wouldn't give up their booty or who had resisted them. And that was a policy that was adopted to incentivize the people that they were attacking to basically acquiesce without a fight. Pirates didn't want to have a fight. Fights were costly for pirate crews. But there's another side to this pirate policy which doesn't get played up in pirate fiction but is equally important. And that is, if you peacefully surrendered and you gave up all of your booty to the pirate, they were very generous to you. They let you go, they showed you mercy, and in fact sometimes they made gifts of the seized cargo back to the sailors, and they did that also in order to incentivize people to behave in a way that would ultimately inure to the profit of pirates.
And along with that, so it was kind of a reputational effect then if you had known that you were going to have this torture. But how did they know which pirates would torture and which ones would not? Or were all of them equally like this?
All of them followed this policy, yeah. I mean, the total number of pirates during the Golden Age was relatively small. There were about 2,500 at the peak. And they were divided into shifting crews, but about 30 total. So these guys all knew each other. Many of them had operated on different crews. And so as a result, the constitution that pirates had, which actually varied from crew to crew, and the basic policies that they adhered to were very similar across crews. The profit-maximizing strategy, since they were all engaged in the same activity, was also similar. So it's not surprising that the same policies, the same basic rules developed among various pirate crews.
So last point on pirates here, the Jolly Roger. What's the economics behind that?
The first thing I have to say is that the Jolly Roger seems too good to be true, right? It seems like it comes out of Hollywood pirates, but it was a real, genuine pirate flag. And the idea is that pirates basically flew this flag in order to distinguish themselves to potential prizes from other potential belligerents that those prizes might encounter on the sea. And that was important because while pirates were criminals, and therefore they could credibly threaten to use this policy of we will do heinous things to you if you resist us, these other belligerents that a merchant ship might encounter, in fact, couldn't do that. And
These
so,
other belligerents, meaning if you're a Spanish ship, possibly an English warship?
yeah, or a Coast Guard vessel. So this is the era of mercantilism. So there were a lot of Coast Guard vessels basically searching for what were called interlopers, smugglers violating mercantilist prohibitions on colonial trade. And so if you're a merchant ship, all the ships looked the same. You couldn't tell whether your potential attacker from afar was a pirate ship who you didn't want to resist because of that policy we talked about, or was maybe a Coast Guard vessel who you might want to hazard resisting. So in order to make their policy fully effective, pirates had to communicate in some way, hey, I'm a pirate, not a Coast Guard vessel, so they hoisted the Jolly Roger.
And this would strike fear into the hearts of people and get them to capitulate without a fight more often.
Indeed it did. Pirate conflict was relatively rare. Again, the opposite more or less of what you see in the movies. Most victims surrendered without a fight.
So in our last minute or so here, what lessons do you think pirates have for us today?
I think there's several. I mean, to me, the most fascinating aspect of it is, first of all, that self-governance, which is ultimately what pirates were developing here, the system of constitutional democracy. This achieving of private order can exist even in the most unlikely, on the surface anyway, of scenarios. Pirates were criminals. These were people who had devoted themselves to earning a living via violence and theft. And yet, it was in their interest to develop rules to regulate that. And as a result, those rules were highly effective. The very effectiveness of pirate self-governance suggests to me that we should perhaps be more optimistic about the ability of self-governance and private institutions to promote social cooperation among legitimate citizens.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you for joining us, Pete.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed today's look back into history. We learned about some of the pro-freedom origins of the Texas War for Independence, and maybe more surprisingly, we learned about how pirates found ways to govern themselves. They innovated systems of checks and balances before formal governance did, and they did this all because they were trying to maximize their profit and minimize social conflict on their ships. This might give us more confidence in how self-governance could work today in situations that are much more stable. It's a theme that we're going to come back to on future episodes. See you next time.